speakers, but please do that in writing. You can use the box question and answers to address questions, and we ask you please to put the name of the person to whom you are directing the question. So at the end of each presentation, there will be a period of answering to the questions. Well, the program today is this one that was already announced. Now we'll have a brief presentation of the roadmap project that is organizing this webinar by Andrea Prota, who is the coordinator of the project. My name is Domingos Viegas. I am from the University of Coimbra and from ADAI, and we are partners of this project, and we are in charge of organizing this webinar. In the webinar, we have 4 speakers addressing this topic. The first one will be Professor Alexandre Tavares. Then we have Daniela Dibucci. Afterwards, you have Massimo Cocco, and finally Flavia Ricardo. In due time, I will say a few words to introduce each one of the speakers. And now I give the floor to Andrea Prota, the coordinator of Roadmap, to please make a presentation of the project. Andrea, please.
So Andrea has disconnected. I don't know why. He was just here, so we need to wait a couple of minutes. I don't know why he got disconnected. So meanwhile, while Andrea connects, we really don't know what happened because he was here a minute ago. I would like to inform all participants that besides the recording and the broadcasting of this session, we will be sending you some certificates because this Zoom system registers your participation and the time you enter, the time you leave. So if you stay here for a considerable amount of time, we will send you your certificate of participation. And after each talk, we will have a period of questions for which you can use the box, the corresponding box. Please don't use the box to say hello or good morning because it will make our life difficult. I don't know, Professor Viegas, if you have Andrea's phone and you can call him or something like that, because he was here.
That's right. Well, I cannot connect him now. I would ask, please, Daniela Dibucci to do that. And in the meantime, not to lose time, I propose that we start with the webinar. I will introduce Alexandre Tavares, and later, when we make a break, I will ask Andrea to give the presentation of the project, okay? So if you allow me, I will introduce Dr. Alexandre Tavares. He is from the University of Coimbra. His background is geology, but he works in the research center on social sciences. So he has a very wide background in the topic of risk analysis and risk assessment. He is a professor of not only topics of geology and let's say earth-related problems and risks, but he also teaches at various post-graduation master and doctoral programs on the risk and civil protection. Dr. Alexandre Tavares, 2 years ago, is in a job that deals with the management of water, the quality of water in the region of Coimbra. And so this makes him very appropriate for this webinar because he has the background of science and research, and he is now also in a decision operational institution, so he has to wear both coats. And for that, I would like to welcome Dr. Alexandre Tavares. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and please give your presentation. Thank you.
Excuse me, I interrupt just a minute. I talked to, yes, with Andrea. They had a blackout in the university building. So he is moving in another building to reconnect, so we can go on. Thank you.
Okay, please, Alexandre.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for inviting me for this sharing one of my research interests in the last years. So it's a pleasure to be here to be part of this group. I'm trying to share right now my presentation. Okay, please confirm to me that is on the screen.
Yes, it is. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. This is one of my interests, try to understand how can we deal with risk models and all of the models that we usually have to deal with the circle of emergency, or before or after in the recovery. How can we deal? What kind of knowledge can we have about this? So I start with the roadmap statement, which brings the importance of participatory process and involvement of stakeholders. In fact, all the risk management, it's fundamental to have new knowledge in every steps of the emergency circle. One of the most common way of doing this is creating interactions between stakeholders and creating some semiotic changes, or doing some way to have organization new capabilities, building new institutional trust, or changing perceptions, and as roadmap statement, increasing the good practice. So my statement, it's based on roadmap, but now I'm going to present three of the most common models to dealing with risk. This is the 31,000 standard. It's very common. They have a sequential approach from the context to the risk treatment in different steps. This is a way that it's very common in the operational organizations, but in the recent years, and now I will present the new approach about this kind of model, when we can see that the risk management process has right now two different approaches, or some were done. There is 5 topics for risk management framework, where the leadership and commitments are designed by 5 topics, and the 8 principles for risk management that support all of the management process. So we can see here a clear adding process by a previous very clean evaluation for a more conceptual approach. One of the more interesting models for risk management, it came from environmental topics. It's were presented by IRGC, International Risk Governance Council, And this was based on two different spheres of assessment. One is the generation of knowledge, and then a decision and implementation actions. This is what I call the circle approach, from the pre-assessment, the risk appraisal, where we have the normal risk assessment process, the concerns about the context of the territory, for example. And then we have a sharing box from where we have the risk judgment. And then we have the risk management from the decision maker to the implementation. All of this was presented and oiled by the communication process. This is one model that it was shared by lots of civil protection area, but it's framed namely all the process of planning, risk planning. But after the presentation, some questions were presented, and it was interesting to have new approaches. The human resources that was framed this kind of approaches because this is important for institutions. The financial and resources that are allowed to be shared, and the institutional means the context. And then, right in recent years, a new presentation of this model was built. As you see, we have different boxes from the pre-assessment to the implementation. We have the same spheres, the knowledge and the decision sphere. But right now we have, as you can see at the center, cross-cutting aspects. There are underlined right now the communication and the stakeholders' engagement. In fact, we have an evolution from the communication for the sharing knowledge with stakeholders and the engagement of them. One of the recent discussed models, very with the scope based with a based approach on climate change area. It's what I call and different authors, what I call the multi-level risk models, risk management model. What is the difference between this kind of approach and the previous approach? We have here a very formal decision-making process, very centered, the formal government decision-making at the center. And then we have two different times of having the assessment of science and expert analysis, where we can have the decision of mitigation actions or adaptation actions, and we have a time for having deliberation and discussion with the substantive producers, mass media, civil protections, non-governmental organization. So this kind of approach, it's very typical right now. We have space and SCAS-CoV-2 underline this kind of approach. And then we have a formal decision supported by a core, inner periphery, a core supporting the decision, and then we have a periphery, an outer periphery, where we can implement this kind of decision. It's a more clear and a formal way of dealing with risk management. This is another presentation of risk multi-level approach, the center of formal decision, and we have here the supporting from the technical, legal, and evaluation components, and the conciliation of interest in a circle, and then the construction of measures that will be decided in a formal way. So this is three different approaches for risk management that I can share with you. So supporting this and try to deal with the roadmap process, I consider that it could be important to have some evaluation what could be the adding process of the plurality of knowledge and values on this kind of a process. Not only on the decision-making process, but dealing with different audience levels of perceptions and from different actors. And we can put this kind of implementing model using different speeches. And what I want to say, it came from what this engagement objectives of stakeholders that was presented by the RGC in 2013. They look for the stakeholders, and they understand that they should have three major objectives: the communication, the feedback, and the co-determination. And let me emphasize the co-determination with the self-commitment and the co-regulation management. So here I present what has been discussed in the last 15 years about how can we characterize the different risk process from the different targets, the impacts or the process. And this is one of the very interesting discussion about risk management. But we have here the four different kinds of risk, of topics of risks, from the simple process, the complex process, the uncertain process, and the ambiguous process. And we have different approaches from the routine-based approach for a discourse-based approach. And this is how can we in a simple way understand. The simple risks are based on instrumental and regulatory application that are internal to organization. Complex problem and risk management are when we have different agents, but we need having knowledge from external stakeholders or experts. The uncertain problems where we have a lack of technical data or model validation, and then the ambiguous risk when we have a different perspective, different way of understanding what could be the impacts, and then we should have. Now I'm going to concentrate on this kind of approach, the impacts. And as you see right now, we have a graph with where we put the actors, the types of participation that are supposed to be part in the simple, complex, uncertain, and ambiguous type of risk. And as you can see, we have different steps, normally heading new actors and promoting new approaches and broad approaches on the discussion for risk management. This is, as you can see, it's a graph with the different stakeholders' involvement to make the decision. So we have from the technical and the instrumental adequacy, the scientific demonstration needs, then when we have the one of the process always done is cost-benefit analysis, and then the strategic deliberation and the co-productions of decision. And in this kind of approach, the value of communication is increasing from the simple to the ambiguous process, and this should be underlined in all the process. So this is what I want to share with you. And the management decisions are always moments of challenge, evaluating resources, promoting interactions, adjusting for predefined models. This is very important to have in mind, and taking responsibility. Decisions are a balance between instrumental capabilities, technical and scientific knowledge, and response to doubts and social pressures. And the role and activity of different experts and stakeholders is increasing, recognized in the decision-making nexus. On the other hand, the common understanding of decision making is in a multi-hazard context with different actors must have an adequate and conceptual view of risk management model. I always try to underline this. It's important to have in all the scope of the complete understanding what kind of model are we using. Knowledge from formal to instrumental recognition on risk model should be essential to have the organization involvement, and we could have the organization trust, and by the way, a good decision. I put here in the simple way, how can we share all of this in the more from the more simple way of look for this in the matrix when we have the consequence and likelihood. If we put here the type of responses, we have here on the green area the operational adequacy. When we go to different levels of consequences or likelihood, we need scientific demonstration, and then cost benefits statement. And in the red area, we always need to be part of a deliberative demonstration with the strategic approach. When we look this kind of approach by the perspective of actors, we have here in the green area the technical and scientific actors in internal way. Then we have the heading here the external intervention, then the involvement of stakeholders, and then not only the stakeholders, all the citizen groups. We have here the simple problems, the complex problems, the uncertain problems, and the ambiguous problems. And this is the background to have a good decision model. And thank you. This is what I want to share with you.
Thank you very much, Alexandre Tavares, for your very nice and clear presentation. I don't see yet questions from the audience, but if you allow me, I'd like to put you a question. The models that you presented show us clearly that the decision process involves collective participation. And from the beginning, let's say the operationals and the scientists are involved or should be involved. But we still have sometimes people that don't understand this, and they don't want to accept that other groups, other professions are involved. How can we overcome this lack of perhaps knowledge or understanding or even intuition, I would say?
Thank you, Professor. It's a good question, and because of the reasons of the question, I said before that it's important to have in our process of decision a clear view what is the model that we are dealing. Most of the decision models, we are doing this with unclear way because we don't have the perspective what is the background that should support our decision. When we have this kind of approach, and we should present this for the decision maker, for the institution, that this is our model. I like more or less, it's not important to discuss right now. If we have the model clear, we should understand what are the topics and the variables that support this. This is one kind of approach that could be a good start. And then I think the communication and the involvement are more recognized right now than 10 years ago. And I think SARS-CoV-2 demonstrated the need of the involvement of different parts. We should have clear formal decision, but we should have some course of end moments and intervention dealing with. And I think all of the persons that are involved in decision making about risk are now very concerned. So my first recommendation is make clear what model are we using for risk management.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. Now I have several questions. One from Chiara Casarotti, who congratulates you for your presentation and is asking if you can give some practical example of an uncertain problem. And from Guy Taylor, he wants to hear your views on how necessary it is to have transparency in the processes that you are advocating for the involvement of all stakeholders, not only the that are under the premise of agreeing or disagree a joint decision. Okay, please.
Okay, the first question, I think I could present two examples. SARS-CoV-2, it's a good example of uncertainty. We have different approaches in the last 15 months. But I make these approaches for instance, in Portugal, about the coastal areas, the erosion and the flooding process in coastal areas. And this is all of the decisions required a good involvement of stakeholders, because we have a lots of conflicts, we have a lots of interest, so it's uncertainty problems, and for dealing with risk erosion or risk about process of erosion and the flooding process in this area. About the question about transparency, it's a good question. It's something that it's very noted right now. I like the multi-level model because it makes clear who is the responsible person or the responsible core of decision, and make clear, for instance, the moment and who is sharing and who is having new information or new elements for the decision. This is one, for instance, in United States, it's very common, this kind of approach. All of the building of the approach of administration is it's doing by this kind of approach. And here, if we have a multi-level, we could control the moment that we have having elements and not and this could be a way of having more transparency.
Thank you, Alexandre. We are now receiving many more questions, but as time is also going, I will just select one.
Okay.
And give also some people are asking for the presentations if they will be available. I inform you that this webinar is being recorded, so you later can get in YouTube all the seminar. Of course, you can see again the presentations. But the question, one of the questions that is put here from Samuel Rufat, is if there is a balance to consider between scientific robustness and efficient communication. Before this, he asked, how much should the scientific community stress the uncertainties of the models, their robustness or validity to the decision makers and civil society? So if there is a balance between considering scientific robustness and efficient communication. I don't know if the question is clear for you, please.
It's a very deep question. There is always a tension between these two poles. It's the reliability of process, the validation of models. It's always put in the different level of the communication, and I think this is completely wrong. One of the most interesting discussion about this, it's about the confidence and the trust about risk governance, for instance, and the communication should be a very the foundation about the kind of trust. And it's difficult to promote trust if we don't understand and try to share the reliability of process and what kind of models are supporting our decision. For instance, 10 years ago, I made an approach in a small county in Portugal, and I have a strict way of understanding, trying to create a new approach of risk mitigation. I try to understand the process, the impacts, and try to validate it. All of this with different models. And then it was not clear, and it was 30 30,000 people involved. It's a small county, and it was not clear how can we put this in the territory. How can we involve the people? And then we try to get a communication plan, and then we have a huge incrementation of trust. And it was very interesting. I was very surprised at that moment. The communication was very important. I couldn't have the points of concentration. I could not implement, for instance, points of concentration for evacuation measures and for fire, for instance, if we don't have a communication process very clear, very understood by the people, very understood from the different association of the community, for instance. And this is always a very tough problem, doing how can we put the model in the same way of the communication. This is what okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. There are other questions. We will send them to you. And if you can answer them by writing, either during the webinar or later, we will also make these questions and answers available to the audience. Thank you once again. I think if you can continue in the meeting, because there may be other exchanges with you. Okay. If you allow me, for the benefit of time, we'll go along. Now we have Andrea Prota. We understand that you had some problem. And if you allow me, I will ask you to make the presentation that was expected to be done at the beginning of the project. Please, Andrea, can you share?
Yes. Yes. Good morning to all participants. Good morning and thanks to Professor Viegas, who managed also an unexpected event, because I was in my university, but we had a electricity power breakdown, probably due to too much air conditioning. So I needed to change location. I'm sorry about this. So now I'm going to share the screen and start with the slides of my presentation. Since I take the word now, before starting my presentation, I would like to thank Professor Tavares and joining all the messages from the chat, because his presentation was really very clear and full of insights. Thank you very much. My presentation is about the project roadmap. As is within this project, today we held this webinar. So the roadmap is an acronym for European Observatory on Disaster Risk and Crisis Management Best Practices. I have the honor to be a coordinator as a president of the CI3R consortium, which is an Italian consortium of research centers. The project has 4 main partners. So it's CI3R, which is Italian Center on Research on the Risks, the Italian Civil Protection Department, University of Stavanger from Norway, and ADAI, the Association for Development of Industrial Aerodynamics. In the map, you see, of course, the geographic location of the partners. We proposed the roadmap project within the UCMP 2020 call, particularly the one named KNAG, and you see on the left-hand side in the red boxes the specific objectives of the call, which mainly were focused on the supporting civil protection and disaster risk management actors, and consolidate the existing partnership between actors from these worlds. How we try to address these and to contribute to these objectives in the roadmap project. You see the response in the boxes with the blue line. So one of the main objective of the project, and we are working hard to reach this objective, is to really try to consolidate a baseline for the creation of a doctrine on disaster risk and crisis management at European level. And in order to do this, we need to make a strong a mutual cooperation between scientists, so people from the scientific community, university and research centers, and authorities in charge of disaster risk management. In order to do this, we need to promote networking activities between people belonging to the community of stakeholders. And stakeholders, we intend experts from both science and decision making. In fact, today, among speakers, we have representatives from these two main communities. We know that sometimes it's not easy to distinguish because we have examples of people coming from the scientific community and now in the decision-making position, or vice versa. But in general, we one of the objectives is to boost the network between these two actors in disaster risk management. The strategy of the project is depicted in this image, in this figure you see on the left hand side of the slide. A key role is played by the advisory group because the advisory group should act as a kind of hinge between the consortium partners I presented in the beginning, the 4 partners and people working with the 4 partners, and the entire disaster risk management community. So we need to promote this networking by asking the advisory group to simulate questions, simulate considerations. We try to elaborate and share with the disaster risk management community and get advice or insights or suggestions from this community. The project has the objective of translating this knowledge, these elaborations into some products, and the products should be dissemination products, so periodic bulletin, thematic papers, and in the end a vision paper which should include the findings, the outcomes that we develop during this time of the project. The duration of the project is 18 months. So we should collect into these documents, this product, best practice and innovation, coming again from the disaster risk management community. Some of the information could be found on the web, and the advisory group has an important role of filtering and stimulating questions and topics. So as you understand, we set up the project based on a bottom-up approach, trying to get from the basis, from people really working in the field, and summarizing, coordinating the aspects coming from the bottom of this world. And again, this advisory group should be for us the group of people that help us to address our efforts in the direction that it seems more important, more most focused with the real problems in this time. So the methodology of roadmap has been depicted in this figure we have in the project. On the left-hand side, you see all these process of production of documents, of products, articles, bulletins, papers, and vision paper. We have the objective of simulating the discussion through meetings. So you see on the right-hand side of the figure, today we have the first webinar. We will have other webinars and also the final workshop. So the consortium partner from one side, they are responsible of preparing outputs, which are the periodic bulletins, the papers, and the vision paper. On the other side, we have the responsibility of organizing the meetings, which for the time being are planned to be online. We hope that in the final part of the project, we can have maybe the final workshop at least in a blended mode. The brain of all this should be in the interaction of the consortium partners and the advisory group. So progressively, we should include every information, every new consideration coming from one side, from the papers or the bulletin, from the other side, from the webinars, and elaborating all these also with the help of the advisory group. And the bottom-up approach gives a lot of value to the DRM community, so to the participants to these meetings, but also to the community which is present also on the web, or the community that will contact us through email, will see maybe the information on the website, and will point out experiences that maybe we are not aware of. And the product, the very ambitious product for us, is to produce a solutions explorer in coordination with the Disaster Risk Management Knowledge Center. And this is for us a reason to show and to be also sure about the sustainability of this project. So we are not producing any new IT product, but and in this moment, please let me thank again the Disaster Risk Management Knowledge Center colleagues, which are really very kind, very collaborative for us. They are providing input in order to help us to make sure that what we produce, it's really could be really included, so it's compatible with the format in terms of organization and also IT format of what there is in the Disaster Risk Management Knowledge Center. So we are producing a conceptual solution explorer, and we hope that this solution explorer could be then added in the organizational flowchart of the Disaster Risk Management Knowledge Center. This image is translated in the project, of course, in work packages. So we have work package 2, which is mainly focused on the interaction of consortium partners with the advisory group. The work package 3 is really focused on the products, on the written products, periodic bulletin, papers, and vision paper. The work package 4 is focused on the meetings, so webinar and final workshop. Please let me thank colleagues who are working hard, coordinating the work packages, and you see them in these slides. I don't read the names because you can see them, but I thank all of them. And also let me say that behind these names, there are groups that I would like to thank. I'm very satisfied about the advance of the project. So from the work packages, we expect results from the interaction and availability of the advisory group, and from its activity. We hope to stimulate the cooperation in disaster response among the actors coming from civil protection, disaster management, marine pollution, humanitarian actors, and in general international organizations. All this should is actually promoting and increasing networking between all these worlds, all these activities. From work package 3, you understand we expect products which will put on black and white the findings and the results of the discussions and of the proposals that are advanced as the project goes ahead. Of course, in addition to the articles, to the papers, bulletins, the Solution Explorer is really the key product on which we are very focused, and we hope that this Solution Explorer will be really as we expected in the beginning. So it's a box where the expertise is developed in ad hoc civil protection and disaster management areas. And all these should put together lessons that can be shared. So lessons on this topic of disaster risk management that could be shared and could improve the response in the future cases. The interaction with the world is active through the website or roadmap website, and also these occasions like this morning webinars are really an opportunity for us to expose our work to the interests of people working in this area. One of the important structure of the project is the steering committee. The steering committee, according to the project, is led by the Italian Civil Protection Department, particularly Professor Mauro Dolce. You see the other members from the partners, and the steering committee has a role of guidance and address of the project activity, and should assure that we act in conformity to European DG ECO priorities and policies. And the steering committee is also the formal group that try to guide the advisory group activity and coordinating the views and also the experiences and the proposals coming from the advisory group that has, of course, different type of expertise. In these advisory groups, as I said, we have representatives from science and decision-making institutions coming from different countries. Their role is to advise the project consortium in order to collect the best practices and systematize these best practices, give support for the selection of the topics, and give input for the thematic papers, and also increase the contact and the exposure of the consortium partner of the project to as much as possible other activities. So in order to make it broader the community of experts and practitioners with which we can interact. In these slides, you see that we have the 9 representatives from the scientist world and 7 from decision makers. I don't read the names for the sake of time, but I thank all of them. Some of them today are speaking in this webinar, but I really thank them for having accepted to be part of the advisory group and for all they have done and will do for the project. Going to the conclusion, we have some outputs that we can mention. One, of course, is the website. Please take note of the website. The website is the tool on which you can find all the information on about the project. Professor Viegas mentioned, reminded that this webinar is broadcasted. So you will find also links to see again these webinars on this website. So roadmap.ci3r.it. We had already a deadline for a first periodical bulletin, which the bulletins are bi-monthly. So the first one was issued in May 2021. If you go on the website, you can download the first, which is learn about the roadmap project and next steps. So of course, it's an introductory bulletin that is already available. We are enriching the group, the working group within partners organization. So we have open until now the call for young researcher. So please, if any of the participants is interested, or if you have anyone to which you can point out this opportunity, take note, because the deadline is June 28th. So there are still some more days, because CIMA Foundation and Ray Lewis, two of the partners of CI3R, have launched this call for young researchers, and young researchers will help us to develop the periodic bulletin. So this is a very good opportunity, and we look forward to as much possible people in order to select the best and the most motivated potential co-workers. The advisory group had already a meeting in April 28th. We had a very fruitful discussion on good practice in the disaster risk management. And when I say fruitful, it means that this discussion has really an impact on the following steps, because the advisory group members pointed out also some criticalities, some needs to clarifications, and this is really what we expect, and for which we thank the advisory group. The meeting was also focused on discussing potential topics for the first thematic paper. The first thematic paper has already a provisional title, Good Practice in Multi-Hazard Risk Operations According to a Scenario-Based Approach. Also, in order to have support for this, we issued a call for 2 experts. Again, please check the website. In this case, the deadline is July 19, so this is a very new call. So we are looking for 2 experts that contribute with us, help us and collaborate with us in order to develop the contents of the first thematic paper. And about the webinar, I told you that we expect more webinars. This is the first one. You know the agenda, which is held today. So I close my presentation by reminding some links about the calls for young researchers and for experts, and reminding you that again, the website is really the platform for all the information and for interacting eventually also with us. So with these slides, I end my presentation. I thank again all participants and give the word to Professor Viegas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and for your presentation of the project, which is very important for everyone to know where we are. Now we are back on our schedule, and I would like to invite Daniela Di Bucci. She's a member of the consortium. She's from the Civil Protection Department in Rome, Italy. Daniela has a PhD in geology with expertise in geohazards, and she works on the scientific advisory unit of the Italian Civil Protection Department. She works on scientific relationships and agreements with research institutes and academia. She works on the Major Risks Commission and the definition of strategies of high scientific content for disaster risk reduction at national and international level. She has worked on the draft of regulations with relevant technical scientific content. She's an author of more than 100 peer-reviewed scientific publications. Daniela is going to talk to us about building an effective collaboration between civil protection decision makers and scientists for disaster risk reduction, the Italian experience. Please, Daniela, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to present the activities of Italian civil protection in this field. Please tell me if you can see the screen.
No, Daniela.
Not
No?
yet.
Okay. Okay. Now?
Daniela, now we can see it.
Okay,
Yes.
And is in, I'm trying to select the presentation mode.
Presentation mode.
Okay, can you see the screen now?
Yes, excellent now.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So let's start with a few concepts. The first one is who are the participants to the management of risk reduction in civil protection in Italy. Here we have two fundamental pillars that are the technical decision makers, that are, for instance, people who work in the civil protection department, but not only us, and the scientific community. And above these two pillars, we have the political decision makers who have to take the most important decision, who represent the political willingness, and who support the activities according to their electoral mandate. In our level, the technical decision makers manage the entire risk cycle, so forecasting, prevention and preparedness, emergency management, and emergency overcoming. And the scientific community is with us and provides data, products, models, scientific information, advice to support the decision-making process. In our field, the importance and the role of the two communities are reciprocally acknowledged, but how to implement the interplay between us, it's another matter, of course. Let me say that there are many examples of interaction between science and decision-making civil protection in the world. Many European countries have their committees and their expert groups that have been appointed by the national authorities. And also countries outside Europe have advisory councils, committees, national academies, and scientific advisors. And within this framework, a role is also played by the national platform issued within the Sendai framework, before in the Hyogo framework, and now in the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. In some cases, there are formal agreements between emergency or civil protection agencies and geological scientific institution, like in the United States. We have the Federal Emergency Management Agency that has a formal agreement with the Geological Survey of the United States. In some cases, the relationship is openly acknowledged. For instance, in New Zealand, the Guide to the National Civil Defense Emergency Management Plan has a chapter devoted to the scientific community, whereas in other cases, the collaboration is behind the writing of governmental documents. For instance, in Spain, the National Civil Protection Strategy acknowledged the contribution by scientists, but are not within the document. In many cases, for instance, in Chile, the scientific community supports the training for civil protection operators. So in Chile, UNEMI created a civil protection academy that is supported by universities. In Italy, the civil protection world manages several kinds of risks that by law are divided in two main groups. The first group is, you can see my arrow, I hope so. Side risks for which the civil protection system takes directly action. And there are other risks, however, chemical, nuclear, radiological, and so on, for which there are other bodies that are responsible, and because they have been identified as responsible by law, and on which, however, civil protection takes action when needed in any case. And one example is the health risk, and that's the reason why in Italy, the civil protection system supported the management of the COVID-19 emergency. In Italy, civil protection is a service, so it's a complex system. It is a multi-level system with distribution responsibilities. It is coordinated by the Civil Protection Department, that's my administration, that's part of the Prime Minister's office, and is ruled by law by the so-called Civil Protection Code, that is a legislative decree that has been issued, was issued in 2018. There are many subjects that make up the system. The components that are the territorial and national authorities, state, regions, local authorities, the operational structures, for instance, firefighters, volunteers, the army, the Red Cross, and so on. And there are also some contributing subjects, such as the professional orders, the companies, public and private companies. And in this context, also the citizens may contribute to the civil protection. So it's a system which includes all of us. In this organization, the scientific community is explicitly mentioned among the operational structure. So it is with us. This long-lasting collaboration with the scientific community dates back to 1976 in the aftermath of the Friuli earthquake. And we have a first formal relationship in the Law 225 issued in 1992, where the scientific bodies and research institutions were included among the operational structures of the National Civil Protection Service, and the Major Risk Commission was established for the first time. In the current code, there are several articles that are dedicated to the scientific community, and this has two reasons. One is the recognition of the important role that the community has and plays in our activities. And on the other side, we need to better regulate this role, because over the years, the question of responsibilities is going to emerge more and more, both at international and at national level. I would like to underline that the role played by the law is not only formal, because it very practically shapes the collaboration between scientists and civil protection decision makers. Because these activities that are the activities that the scientific community develops in the civil protection system are stated by law. And you can see the most classical activities, routine and operational activities. I mentioned the monitoring and surveillance of, for instance, volcanoes, weather, forest fires, and so on. And the related development of databases and the management of emergency, the forecast and prevention activities. There are also some experimental activities that prepare to the routine and operational ones. They represent a pre-test, pre-operational phase where we tune the tools that we are preparing with the scientific community. We have also targeted research that is the base which prepares the development of the 2 points above, and the collaboration in the preparation of technical regulation that are of our interest. And sorry. And the development of this activity follows this arrow. So from the targeted research, we move to pre-testing and pre-routine activities, and then we move to the routine and everyday operational activities. The scientific community is represented by the so-called competence centers, that are entities that provide services, information, data, processing, and tactical scientific contributions. in several specific fields. You can see here a picture where you can have a general look of the number of institutions involved. They are about 40 institutions, and a dozen of them are research institutes. And to be competent centers, according to the code, these research bodies and institutes, consortia and university structures, have to own and make available knowledge and provide products that can be integrated in civil protection activities. A particular emphasis is placed on the possibility of establishing networks of competent centers, and the CE3R that Andrea Prota presented before is one of these networks. Which are the contributions that science can provide with civil protection? We have permanent activities of civil protection and finalized research. Both these activities have been just described, are carried out by competent centers and are generally funded or co-funded by the Civil Protection Department and also by the regional civil protections in cases. Then we have permanent commission, permanent scientific commission. This is a general description, but we have the most important one is the Major Risk Commission, that is the advisory body of the National Civil Protection Department. We can have commission also that we issue on specific subjects. For instance, we worked with a scientific commission to work on the Vesuvio volcano civil protection emergency plan, or for instance, after the earthquake in L'Aquila in 2009, we issued a commission to establish if there was any possibility to forecast or to predict the occurrence of earthquakes. Then we often have to manage research funded by the other subjects that is of interest for civil protection purposes. Other subjects are other institutions at national level, but are also European projects, and that's also the reason why we are here in some way. And finally, there are many spontaneous research works carried out by single researchers or small groups of research that in some cases touch topics of civil protection interest and that have to be managed with care. Of course, it's often difficult to keep separate the contribution of scientists and those of decision makers because we interact continuously. The process of decision making is fueled by this feedback interaction. And so with this continuous contact between the two parties, distortion of the roles may occur and imply some confusion and some undue responsibilities in the decision. And there are many cases in this can occur, especially if some of the participants or some of the parts of the decisional process do not or cannot accomplish their task or go beyond their role. An example is given by the political decision makers who, when they do not decide which is the acceptable level of risk, are 10 victims per year too much acceptable? This is a decision that the political level doesn't like to take. Or in other cases, we have the scientist community that suggests to the civil protection operator to move tent camps from one side or to the other one of the country that is not among their competencies. One possibility to help in this process is the inclusion of the hybrid expert in a public administration. Who are hybrid experts? Are civil servants, are public officials who have a solid expertise both in research and in public administration. So they can understand and they can use the language of the two fields and have an expertise that is recognized by both the scientific and the decision-making communities, and therefore are upon to play an interface role, because they can link the demands and expectation and the short time scales of the decision makers, especially during an emergency, and the data, the information and uncertainties than the usually longer time scales of scientists. The Italian civil protection has a long tradition of hybrid experts who facilitated and facilitate nowadays the interaction between the two groups. And this is a list that I don't want to go into detail, but I want to show you concerning the kind of hybrid experts that have worked in the civil protection system in the last 3 decades. We have full professors, research managers that work with us. We have high-level decision makers that work in scientific groups or commissions. And there is a continuous exchange at the governmental level up to the minister. We had a full professor that was a minister or an undersecretary for the coordination of civil protection. And that in the Majorities Commission, in the technical scientific committees, also issued by other administration, and at international level, European and international. There are pros and cons in having hybrid experts in a public administration. One pros is the effective orientation that we can give to the activities of research institutions toward topics of civil protection interest. And in this way, we can fully exploit the best scientific advances for our purposes. On the other side, a certain amount of interference in scientific matter by a non-scientific public administration is possible. And this, for this, a public administration might give up the interface action carried out by hybrid experts to keep scientific advice and decision making, therefore responsibilities, separate. In some cases, the solution adopted is to delegate the interface role to especially established scientific committee. But I have to say that scientists in this committee do not usually have civil protection skills. And in this way, the public administration loses its role of guidance and coordination. And this is assigned in Italy, this is assigned by law to the Civil Protection Department. From a European perspective, the relationship between science and decision making is established since 1313 decision in 2013. This is the decision that establishes the civil protection European mechanism. And the law talks about a training network. So there is an involvement in the training of the operators to manage the emergency all over the Europe. But in the decision of 420 issued in 2019, which amends the decision 1313, the Union Civil Protection Knowledge Network is introduced. And this is a network which includes centers of excellence, universities, and researchers, together with the Commission, together with the civil protection, disaster management actors and institutions. And this knowledge network is further strengthened by the last regulation issued in 2021. And Europe, I have to say, that is making huge efforts to build this knowledge network, because it is an important structure, and Europe is trying to involve all the different stakeholders in this activity. What is doing Italy and Italian civil protection to contribute to this knowledge network? The first example is roadmap. We are here for this. A second example is we are trying to build a high-profile academic course to train professionals with skills in disaster risk reduction and in civil protection, working with the Conference of the Italian university rectors to promote these disciplines of interest of civil protection into the Italian university curricula. And we are also trying to integrate STEM disciplines and social sciences, in particular behavioral science. On the one hand, to communicate properly. We saw the previous presentation mentioning this issue. And on the other hand, to try to include social vulnerability in our assessments and evaluations. Some question, is this model, the current model that we have in Italy, applicable in the coming year in Italy? The strength of the model, we think that is the full and daily involvement of the scientific community in every phase of the disaster risk management cycle. And they are side by side with us, and they help us. This collaboration has helped by the role played by hybrid experts who work as a hinge. There are also some weaknesses because we are seeing an increasing complexity of the risk management. We have a multi-hazardous dimension that is developing. We have NATEC and cascading effects. And this implies the need of specific skills that have to be developed before an emergency occurs. A second point of weakness is that we are in the hand of the Prime Minister. So it's a little bit a top-down approach in some cases. And this approach that is not fully top-down because we have a lot of interaction at all different levels. But this could be further improved with a greater use of bottom-up approach. We are thinking to include local knowledge in disaster risk reduction, and we would like to make more and more decisions shared with and accepted by the population. And in this activity, a fundamental role is played by the volunteers organizations. Is this model applicable abroad? Not directly, of course. Can you hear me? Sorry?
Yes, Daniela.
Daniela, yes.
I had a change in the microphone, sorry. Every country has its own uniqueness. We have in each country, we have specific institutional organizations, regulatory frameworks. We have different socio-cultural environment. And
Daniela, can you be maybe closer to the microphone?
Yes. Is this good for you? Can you hear me?
Okay.
And so there is no one civil protection model that is valid for all countries. But some ideas and solutions adopted in Italy are a possible good input for other countries and Europeans or international bodies who work on disaster risk reduction. We can present you 4 good practices, for instance. The first one, summing up what I've said just up to now, is the scientific participation and the contribution of the scientific community is regulated by law. This makes roles and responsibilities clear. This is what we think is very good. And also the scientific community is formally part of the civil protection system, and this works quite well. It is important the cross-fertilization between STEM disciplines and social sciences, in particular behavioral sciences, and we underline the presence of hybrid experts in the civil protection system. There are also a couple of solutions for potential pitfalls. One is the way the scientists are selected. We prefer to have a plurality of experts working together, providing a shared point of view. This is obtained working with research institutes and commission rather than with the individual scientific advisors. And the second point is which is the level of scientific acceptance of the research products on which we have to rely to make decisions. The solution in our case is provided by law, is the civil protection codes that indicates the quality required for the scientific results and the products for civil protection use. So to conclude, we were asked to answer this list of questions that you see on the left side of the screen. And our final answer here on the right side. We think that in this presentation, you can find the answer of the questions that you poses. So thank you. Just to tell you that for who is interested, to a list of bibliographic references that can be of your interest. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniela, for your very interesting presentation. This was very clear. I'd like also to greet Flavia Ricardo, who joined the group of panelists. Okay, we have some questions to Daniela. I would like to ask, to remind the speakers, the members of the panel, that you can also ask questions directly to the speakers if you wish. I will put you, Daniela, one question that was asked by Luis Sá, I think from Portugal. He says that disaster risk reduction activities promoted by the Italian National Platform. What are these activities? And he asks also if they have some kind of funding by the government.
No, the disaster platform that has been issued after the Yogo framework and then is ongoing now under the Sendai framework is an inter-institutional panel where there are representatives from ministries, from the regions, the provinces, and the Association of Municipalities of Italy. There are research institutes and so on. And we are trying to work together to establish some important documents, such as the national risk assessment that we have to provide with the European Commission, or the capability management assessment, that is another document that we have to provide due to the decision 1313. And we share with them the opportunity to exchange data and information. So there are no funds assigned on this institution because every administration who works within this group has his own funds, and we work together in a loyal, how can I say, we are working together because we are all public administrations, let's say, in this way.
Okay, Daniela, thank you. I'll now try to link two questions. You can read them in the question and answers as well. I will read a summary for the benefit of the audience because they cannot read them. From Bjorn Ivar Kruke, he's asking if he agrees that the scientific community can provide a lot of good inputs in various phases. He asks if you have any experience in embedded research. So researchers collecting data during the crisis response in acute phase. This is one question. And the other one is from Beatriz Balino. She mentions that the World Climate Research Program is setting an initiative called World Academy, to broker between climate education needs and courses available. The course that you advertised would be of interest to this initiative. Can I get in contact with you about this later?
Okay, for the second question, yes, of course, Beatrice can contact me by mail. I'm available, of course. About the first question of Bjorn, I don't know if you think that's good or bad that there are scientists who collect the data during an emergency. I can describe some cases that are very positive. For instance, during an earthquake emergency, the research institutes who work on seismic monitoring, let's say the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, for instance, but not only this institute, go in the field, temporary network to better record the seismic sequence that is ongoing. In this way, they of course collect data, but these data are useful to better understand the process. So are useful also in a civil protection from a civil protection point of view. And also, I see here and there, many researchers make surveys on the conditions in which the buildings are, if the buildings are damaged or not, or for instance, churches, palaces, or other important buildings. and the infrastructure. And while they are doing this kind of assessment, also they collect data, but it's, yes, it's good. We are very happy with this collaboration. The problem is that there are all of these activities are coordinated under the sea protection department activities. So the problem is when individual researchers alone go in the area of an emergency to collect data, they can be a problem also in the management of the situational event.
Okay, Daniela, we'll take another and last question to you from Guy Taylor. With all these different approaches across the European Union, what would happen if there was a major incident in any of the seas used or surrounding the European Union?
This is a good question. When we talk about seas that are under European regulations, is the European mechanism, the sea protection mechanism, who operates supported by the member states. The mechanism is preparing to address multinational emergencies, both on land and in the seas. When you are in seas that are outside Europe, the coordination role is generally carried out by the United Nations, and Europe cooperates with the United Nations. So there is a chain of activities that is already in place. We participate through Europe to these activities. There are also cases where each member state has bilateral agreements. In this case, they participate also directly, but in general, the member states and Europe cooperate with the United Nations.
Thank you, Daniela. Andrea, you wanted to say something, I understand.
Yes, yes, thank you, Domingos. First of all, thank also from me to Daniela for the very clear and interesting presentation. Yes, I wanted to greet our officer, the officer of our project, Dr. Artur Malankovic, who is online, and we thank him for his participation. We are very glad he found time to participate to the webinar, and of course we will get comments and remarks from him after the webinar. So Artur, thank you. We are very glad you are present. And I also wanted to acknowledge the presence of Professor Mauro Doce. As I said, he is the coordinator of our steering committee. Then with respect to two questions, very quick comments from me. One to the question from Guy Taylor in terms of different models of civil protections in different countries. I think this is a moment of sharing of information. So it is a pleasure for me to inform Guy and also other people interested that roadmap, CI3R is also participating to another project which has the acronym of BORIS, and the BORIS is a cross-border risk assessment for increased prevention and preparedness in Europe. Is a project where CI3R is coordinating, and with participation of University of Ljubljana, FAX from Austria, AFAD from Turkey, and UOM from Montenegro. So just to say that we agree with the guide. This is a critical issue, and if you are interested, please check on the CI3R website and connect with us also about the topic of the project. And finally, I wanted to stress on the question from Bjorn. Daniela already mentioned this. We had in Italy very good experience, and this is also a personal experience in in terms of collection of data which were used during the management of an emergency right after an event. But since they were collected in a very organic and systematic way, they were then very useful for development of models to improve the management of the emergency, to model prevention models, and also to collect data that were used at governmental level to issue, for example, laws or regulations. So I confirm that this is very important, and this was a very interesting way to show that the collaboration between the decision makers and universities and research centers was, as we said, win-win for all of us, and specifically for the citizens. Okay, Domingos, thank you. The word to you.
Thank you, Andrea. Okay, now I present our third invited speaker. Is Professor Massimo Cocco from the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology from Rome in Italy. He research are focused on the physics of earthquakes and faults. Most specifically, his work deals with earthquake dynamics and fault interaction, seismicity patterns, and fault friction properties. He's interested in both theoretical studies and observational research. He has interests in all aspects of mechanics of earthquake and faulting from observations of natural faults, from geophysical and geological measurements to experimental faults at laboratory scale. His expertise also covers the management of seismic networks and monitoring research infrastructures. He has coordinated the preparatory phase and is presently coordinating the implementation phase of the European project named EPOS, European Plate Observing System. Its mission is long-term integration of research infrastructures for solid Earth science. Let me tell you that Professor Massimo Cocco actually inspired the topic of this webinar that we are having today, because he identified in a previous meeting that we had this issue of the coordination between researchers and operational members. So Professor Massimo Cocco is going to talk us about scientific data and products to support a knowledge base for decision making in disaster risk management. Professor Massimo Cocco, you are welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to give this presentation in this webinar, which is quite timely and extremely important. I'm going to present to report my experience and the importance of integrating scientific data and scientific products to support decision making. So first, I wish to start making a general description of which are the different stages that we need to manage the interactions and moving from science to decision making. In particular, the first is the background scientific research or fundamental research, which involve a collection of data, scientific data and scientific products through monitoring and research infrastructures, which is the background.
Massimo,
yes?
Massimo, sorry, I don't know if we are still on the first slide. I don't know if you are moving the slides or not, because we see.
Can you see? Can you see now?
We only see the first slide,
okay,
the cover.
So, okay, sorry for that. I will try to
as Massimo solved the problem, maybe it's good to say, Domingos, that we have a very good participation. We have about 170 participants, and we thank all people. Okay, you solved the problem. Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so I was just saying that I would like just to see different steps, which in my opinion represent the different activities from moving from science to decision making. In particular, starting with fundamental research, background research, which involve monitoring, which is collection of data through monitoring networks, facilities, and research infrastructure, which is the background in order to proceed with the understanding of the physical chemical processes, the causative processes, and therefore also to interpret the causative processes and the forecasting. This is followed by, of course, surveillance, which is the monitoring applied to provide real-time information and alert systems, and of course, the components necessary to manage the risk, hazard, vulnerability, and risk assessment. This is the part which is in the scientific domain. This is transferred to decision-making for prevention, emergency planning, and management, and disaster response and recovery. And this decision-making is applied to society through communication and the planning of the prevention and the emergency. I'm not an expert of disaster risk management and even risk, so I am an expert of, as a scientist, of generating and interpreting data. So this is what is usually called, the first two steps is what is usually called scientific knowledge. And this is exactly the transition for the evidence-based decision-making. In my speech, I would like to focus on this portion because this is my expertise, and I would like to focus on the importance of integrating data. Before doing that, I would like to mention, however, that we all agree about the importance of sharing knowledge and how much this is important for evidence-based decision-making. This interface has been already described by Professor Tavares and Daniela, and of course it depends on dialogue and communication policies, because these are full of rules and policies, procedures and translation, mediation and adoption of practice, but in particular partnerships. But here it is clear that for partnerships means that there are there are research organizations and experts that are playing an authoritative role recognized by the policy adopted in the member states. For instance, Daniela was showing us what the Italian civil protection is doing. However, in my opinion, it is impossible to manage the relationship between science and decision-making without taking into account society. This problem is not bidimensional, and it is three-dimensional. And it is also these three sectors are interconnected, while the problem society is. Can you hear me?
Massimo, we lost you for a few seconds. Now we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, and of course, the interaction with the society depends on communication, empowerment of the society and the local community, and the literacy, because the society needs to understand which is the procedures and the policies and the methodologies adopted to do risk management. And of course, the relationship between society and decision makers depends on transparency and ethics, trust and participation. So in my opinion, this is a general remark that the relationship between science and decision making cannot exclude society. And I will come back to this point at the end of my presentation. Now, my background expertise concerns solid earth science. Solid earth science means earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, geological phenomena, surface dynamics, and so on. And of course, as you can imagine, generating data for solid earth science means that there are very different scientific communities involved, which might have a different expertise and maturity on the efforts and resources needed to integrate the data. Of course, there are multidisciplinary data, and there are also services provided to society at operational level, both at national and international level. In solid earth science, of course, dealing with geohazard and risk, georesources, and also anthropogenic hazards. So solid earth science is a proper framework to share scientific knowledge. The second issue that I would like to raise is the importance of the research infrastructures, because a research infrastructure is a system where you can provide virtual access to data and physical access to facilities. I would like to remember you that not only the access to data virtually it is important, but for instance, during the Icelandic eruption in 2010, we were using experimental laboratories, rock physics laboratories, in order to measure the ash composition and to understand how far away this could propagate in the atmosphere. Research infrastructure are important for strengthened data management and interoperability, but more important, they also allow communication with different stakeholders. Of course, being a key contribution to support open science and a safe exploitation of georesources. And I would like to use EPOS, which is the European Plate Observing System, which is a European research infrastructure in which I am still working, and I worked in the past 15 years, because in this case, we can make some example useful for the today discussion. EPOS means European Plate Observing System is committed to establish a sustainable and long-term access to solid earth science data and services, integrating existing and new European research infrastructure, adopting a federated approach. There are 25 countries in Europe participating to the data provision, the data sharing, and 140 research organizations. Many of these research organizations are committed to provide the monitoring and the surveillance on the national territory. So it is not a research project. It is an integration plan, a long-term integration plan for the entire solid earth science. I use the architecture. I would like to use the EPOS architecture in order to show you where the data are generated, how the data are integrated, and how we can foster and support the use of multidisciplinary data. Data are generated at national level, local level. This is the place where the communities have the expertise to generate the data, creating, processing, analyzing, preserving, and also giving access. And most of these research infrastructure have not been built for research. They are being built for the surveillance, the monitoring of the seismic, the volcanic areas, territories. But of course, they produce a huge amount of data for fundamental research and for the monitoring of the causative phenomena. So what we have done in EPOS, we have asked the different communities, seismology, geodesy, geology, anthropogenic hazard, satellite data, to integrate this data in order to make them interoperable. And this is the way in which quality is ensured. Data generation is quality, the priority is quality. Excellence came when the use of the data are used for scientific application. So here we have the capability to keep this data, to generate data products, and to make all these data interoperable and accessible to an hub, which is accessible to different users, mostly scientists within and outside the solid earth science, national authorities, including civil protection, and in the future, of course, also to society and the private sector. This hub, central hub, the legal seat of the consortium, of the EPOS consortium, is seated in Italy, and the hub is seated in UK and France. But the important point that in this way, we can contribute to produce access to data, making them findable, accessible, interoperable, usable, which means fair. Now, let me make a first comment here. We are referring about the use of data, but we should clarify what does it mean data. For instance, a raw data, like a seismogram. This is, of course, the maximum level of open access. Seismologists share the data in real time during a seismic sequence, during an earthquake, during an emergency. Recently, in the last year, also the data for mobile network, portable deployments have been shared in real time, which means that any seismologist in the world can download the data in real time. Now you have a level 1, which are data coming from nearly automated procedures. For instance, distribution of earthquakes, seismicity, focal mechanisms, and so on. But you have data products coming from the scientist action. Here there is an example of an interferograms with satellite data to show the deformation map following an earthquake. But it could be also a seismic source, causative source for an earthquake. This is an example for the L'Aquila 2009 earthquake, but also the propagation of seismic waves in the earth, in the crust. So this means that at this level, data products involve the work, the expertise of individual, of scientists. And therefore, there are data that are community actions. Here I have two examples. The seismic hazard map, which is committed by the civil protection, for instance, and is done by a pool of coordinated experts, or a map of active faults. This is the active faults from California. Intentionally, I avoided Europe and Italy, because this, of course, there is a community behind these data products. And finally, there is software, which is useful to mention because open source is now a paradigm adopted by them. Now, if we now look to this taxonomy, we can understand that, of course, there are different stakeholders used. So raw data are open, but of course, scientists, students, or skilled people can access to this raw data. When you go to data products coming from nearly automated procedures, also society, because when there is an earthquake, people are used to go on the INGV website, on the other website, to see, they know the magnitude, and also key stakeholders. But as soon as you increase the level of the taxonomy for the level 2 and level 3, now you are producing high-level data products, which are also used for disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction. In this case, of course, what we should clarify, what does it mean open access? Because open access does not mean anonymous, free, real-time access to everyone. And this is a first common, which means a way to balance between the connections between the scientist and decision maker with the society. Now, let me make another example of why it is important to integrate data. I do the example for seismology. Seismologists integrate data, seismic waveforms, and these seismic waveforms are quality controlled, integrated at European and global level, and access to seismologists to study the ground shaking, the faults model, and so on. These data are integrated in the real time at global level in the world with the standards for data and metadata. Now, the same data, especially the strong motion data, can be integrated with different metadata in order to provide access to engineers, for instance, earthquake engineers or new services for seismologists like the European strong motion database. But this now is accessible also to other professionals and to global organizations. And therefore, you have with the same data a different virtual access from other stakeholders. This data can be used to calibrate the ground motion predictive equation, which is the ground shaking close to the seismic fault around the earthquake causative source. And this can become a new product, which is used for hazard assessment, which is used to new map. For instance, now we have one of the key issues of seismic hazard map is the resolution of the data close to the faults in order to constrain the ground shaking and to predict the ground shaking during earthquake. And you see in this example that a user can become a data product provider. And this is a substantial progress in providing data from science, fed by scientists, useful to decision-making stakeholders. Another example is the multidisciplinary data. So access to real-time data is essential to manage the emergencies. This is an example of the earthquake location during the Amatrice Norcia earthquake, and also many of the earthquakes of the seismic sequence in the Apennines. This is what routinely is done by INGV in Italy, as well as by many other research organizations in the world. So it is clear that real-time data are essential to provide information and expert opinion. But at the same time now, sharing near real-time scientific products is vital to provide expert opinion. This is now an example, for instance, of a deformation map measured from satellite data during the Norcia October 30, 2016 earthquake. And one important is that now, thanks to this multidisciplinary data, if these data are integrated, we have really an unprecedented capacity to constrain, for instance, in the case of the Amatrice earthquake of 2016, within 48, 72 hours, we constrained the source model more or less with 70–80% of what has been confirmed in the months and the year afterward. But to do this, we need to integrate the multidisciplinary data, and we need the services. And of course, now we have services to process big data. I will make later an example of this, and supercomputing. Another example, near real-time services. This came from the time series done by our colleague from IREA, which is a competence center, CNR, Italy, competence center of the civil protection. And this is the measuring of the deformation in the Phlegraean field caldera with the time series progressing. And you see that processing the data you can measure the different deformation. And this is a service done. Now, if you see here, I don't know if you see my cursor, there is an area on the north, an area on the east. This is not the reason for the monitoring, but here, for instance, is the subsidence for the concrete deployed for the high velocity railway, which is subsiding now. And more important, you see in the north that there is an area. This is the subsidence of the Pompeii cultural heritage site. So this is just an example of the way in which the processing of the data in real time, near real time, can open a new way to provide the services to different stakeholders. As far as supercomputing is concerned, in EPOS we have a center of competence for supercomputing, which is a project CHEESE, coordinated by Spanish, BSc Barcelona EXIC, which is dealing with supercomputing. And the reason why I wish to mention this here is because in this case, in this project for different users, there is the attempts to check the capacities to do urgent computing during the emergencies. And there are 3 pilots, one of the ground shaking, another for tsunami, another for ash dispersal, that are checking the capability that immediately after an event, there is a capability using access to supercomputing to develop new products useful during the emergency management. And of course, there are supercomputing use for hazard assessment, for prevention, and let's say peacetime actions. An example for this is the ash dispersal. Here on the top, you know very well the famous, with the completely impossible name to pronounce, Icelandic volcano of 2010. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. And here there are examples of the same services for the Catania airport. This is another example in which science is used for services, not only for the civil protection, but also for the industry and for the private. In this case is the flight companies and the airport management. And of course, to do this, we need supercomputing because we need to include the knowledge from volcanologists with the petrologists and rock physics and meteorologists in order to improve the capacities to develop these services. Another example is the use of artificial intelligence in order to process the data collected during seismic sequences. Until 10 years ago, we were doing our job, even in the Gulf Fiorito, with catalogs having thousands of earthquakes. But now we are moving to hundreds of thousands of earthquakes, but using different other type of computational services and artificial services, we arrive now to record the catalog during the sequences of 500,000 of events. This means having a resolution which is unprecedented. However, this, as I will comment at the end, will also yield to complexities, and which has to be managed in real time. Also, another example of a service which is provided for prevention is the tsunami alert system, which is active at INGV, but in Italy, which is done together for the civil protection. But there are also other centers in Europe for the tsunami. And this is another example in which the regional hazard maps are used in order to provide information of the inundation scenarios that are used, of course, for the prevention action and information to society, of which would be the inundation area for a potential tsunami following an earthquake or a landslide. And another example on the difference is the real-time assessment, which is done when the alert is used. So there is an earthquake. After the earthquake, there is, of course, the capacity to see the tsunamigenic potential. Uncertainties are used by the source probabilities and uncertainties in the location. And there is, of course, the alert with the possible impact and given to the stakeholder. So this is another real-time service which is used thanks to the work done by scientists in developing tsunami simulations, earthquake source locations, and the characterization. Last comment is on induced seismicity and anthropogenic hazard, because this is another way in which scientists work to characterize the anthropogenic hazard, but also to distinguish triggered, induced, or natural events. which is, of course, a huge societal impact, which needs to further efforts to integrate this expertise by comparing the information collected in different places in Europe. This is the case of what the Anthropogenic Hazard Thematic Core Services in EPOS is doing. And where there are services open to scientists about this episode of induced seismicity. With this example, I would like to move to the conclusion. And to conclude, I have 3 slides in which I would like to focus on 3 aspects. First, for what I presented, of course, I strongly supported the open science. But what I would like to show you that there is a clear ethical issues in the way in which when a research organization is committed to generate and collect data, obeying to open science, but at the same time, there are commitments taken with the decision makers for the surveillance. And in particular, you see in this triangle, there is, of course, data collection, monitoring, support to science and open science, but there is risk mitigation and risk communication. And here is the example, what does it mean to communicate, to give open access to the services associated to a seismic hazard map, also a seismic hazard assessment. And at the same time, there is the issue of impartiality for public good in the moment in which the monitoring of the territories also concern areas where there is exploitation of georesources by private companies. Now, there is a clear ethical issues which is given by the center of mass, which is difficult to find among these 3 components, because unfortunately, this triangle is not equilateral as it is simplified in this figure. So this is one issue that I would like to comment about the ethical implication. The second one is the chain, which is the way to provide, to involve the society. Providing access, I think that I already show you the importance of integrating data, providing use and reuse and access to facilities. How much this is important for understanding, processing, modeling, but also data massive applications. This is what I tried to show you. And how this can feed the discovery. Not only discovery for science, but also training and education and authoritative service for decision makers. But the point is that we need to maintain trust. And this is the issue which I would like to focus here for society and decision makers, because as soon as you create any type of interface or communication interface between scientist and decision maker, this should not interfere with the authoritative role this research organization and scientists are playing. But of course, authoritative means trust. And society should recognize this. And this is a further demonstration that the relationship between scientist and decision maker is not bidimensional, but involve at any level society, in particular with the current level of the presence of the media and the social media. The conclusive remarks, and integrating and sharing scientific data and products represent a contribution to decision making and emergency planning. I only provide the example because I believe that we are all convinced about that. And I hope that I convinced you that research infrastructure, I used EPOS as an example for solid earth science, but there are many other in the health, life science, and the energies and so on. They can contribute to maintain the integration for disaster risk management. However, data management and open access must be supported. And this is not so trivial. For instance, data preservation and data provision is not used in Italy as a criterion to evaluate research organizations. We are evaluated for our nature paper, but not for maintaining, generating, and sharing data. Second, we need to include policies to support data management and data sharing. For instance, very simple, any project funded should dedicate 5 to 10% of the budget to maintain the data accessible and to curate the data for the future. Sharing best practices for data management is, of course, trivial. And the last comment, open access cost. And the sustainability of open access to scientific data is still unsolved. Who will pay for maintaining this data accessible forever? The example for scientific publication is not so optimistic in this case. integrating science into decision making requires to adequately involve societies and communities. And this opens the issue of providing access to scientific information, which is a completely different task and goal with respect to data, because you need to use lay language and you need to explain also the science behind the products which is used for decision making. And this is a huge undertaking. E-science innovation is improving the capacity of understanding the causative processes in which they are imaged and monitored, but this will further unravel complexity. When we have millions of aftershocks, the faults became much more complex than we were thinking. And therefore, the question is how to include uncertainties and complexities in the knowledge system to support the decision making. And last, upstream and downstream services, including early warning and alert system for decision making, require effective frameworks to operate them for prevention and emergency planning. This also concerns a legal framework and legal exposition of scientists and decision makers involved in the game. There is a fluctuating boundary between science, communication, and law, which has to be considered if we want to plan the future. And I close here using a sentence from Kofi Annan that I think it is illuminating about how difficult it is for politicians to follow the prevention. Thank you. And I hope that I respected the time.
Of course. Thank you very much, Massimo, for your very good presentation, very informative and very instructive, I should say. And you brought lots of challenges. I don't know if you have already questions from the audience, but I invite also my colleagues from the panel if you want to address any comment or any question to Massimo while we wait for some questions from the general audience that is now at number one. We have more than 170 people attending the webinar.
Domingos,
Andrea,
maybe I try to stimulate some thinking from the participants by asking a question to Massimo. Maybe I think Flavia can take this over after because she is also experiencing very much in this period. Massimo, your presentation touched upon something that the first speaker, Tavares, mentioned. I wrote down 2 words he said. In his slides, he had the terms joint decision. And I think your presentation stressed the importance of the involvement of the citizens in the decisions and the complexity of all this process. We also listened from Daniela that in our country, in Italy, the presence of hybrid competency from one side in public administration, from one side is a good part, from another side increase the complexity. So based on your experience, not a question, but can you make a comment on, in your view, which would be the ideal joint decision? Because we know that people should be aware of risks and of consequences. Of course, the question is how can we allow for a joint decision in the interest of people? Because my experience is that if you want to have really literally a joint decision, maybe you cannot take a decision. However, scientists know we suppose we know the best for the people. So how much the joint decision is only awareness, or how much is sharing of information? Because in your first slide, you said that complexity is increased by the fact how many variables you can share, how much people can understand the variables or the parameters. Thank you.
Yeah, it is a good point. So in my opinion, I don't want to enter here in the issue of the distinction of roles between scientists and decision makers, because this would require an hour of discussion. So I don't touch this. And because scientists have completely different opinions of that. I want to answer you in a different way. I would like to make a suggestion. So in my opinion, the only way to make participation, the society of the local communities to share decisions is has to be done during the prevention stage. If you don't create the literacy, the awareness, what is called preparedness, if you don't call the condition, because if you have the different types of earthquakes, of disaster, have a completely different approach. For instance, if you have a pollution, of a contamination of a site, and you go there for do remediation action for soil contamination, for pollution, it is very local, and therefore the way of participation is specific to a very clear action, and there are rules that very, very distinguished between the pollutant and the remediators. But if you have an earthquake and people like in Italy forget that Amatrice is a seismic area, that Sulmona is a seismic hazard area, and therefore it's during the prevention that you need to create the people to be aware and prepared. However, I don't think that they need to have access to the detail of the technical discussion between scientists and decision makers. And this is the open question. So how to create transparency and trust, maintained a minimum level of information which is ethically coherent and enough to maintain and to feed the preparedness and the participation. For instance, how many evacuation evacuation plan we have in the cities, in the earthquake-prone areas? If during the peacetime you speak with these people, if there is a tsunami, if there is an earthquake, you need to go where you are in this direction. You create a culture of the disaster management in which society participates. Society should not participate in discussing how I compute the change in probability of occurrence of an earthquake using a model or another. This is not the level in which we should engage society, but this we should be aware as a scientist. It opens a completely different world because means that we need to disseminate scientific information, which is completely different than explaining scientific data to Daniela, which is a civil protection, but she's a scientist, seated in the opposite part of the table. So that is the point. And to me, there is no disaster risk management without prevention. All the possibility to manage the emergency depends and benefit of what you have done during the peacetime.
Thank you very much, Massimo. Let me bring you a question from the audience, from Umberto Fracassi. He says that what you said, your elements require a culture revolution, a long-term culture revolution in our collective societies. And he says that he's persuaded that this stimulus rests also on our shoulders as scientists, practitioners, and stakeholders from the public. His question is, do you think that this perception of geosciences could eventually elicit a novel perception of precisionists of the value of the things? I think you can also read the question and interpret it, please.
It is not an easy question because it is clear that there is a cultural change. It is clear. But again, if we use services not only for a dialogue between scientists and decision makers, but you also maintain services to explain the society how this dialogue works, the society will be more prepared to understand the prescription, the indications, the results of decision making. So, for example, earthquake early warning systems. In Italy, in Europe, we are not less smart than Japanese that we don't use earthquake early warning. The reason is that if I am in Naples, I have 20 seconds to take a decision, while in Japan, they have 3 minutes. This makes a big difference from a technical point of view. But the real problem for using operational earthquake forecasting of the earthquake early warning are the legal implications. We don't have and these cultural frameworks cannot be done by scientists and decision makers. It is the country that needs education and training has to be done not only by us during the emergency or during the prevention. We need to change the culture, even the culture of how data are managed and used. I agree with Umberto, but it is clear this is not our duty. So we cannot be responsible for a cultural change. It is that we need to change the educational system to prepare to manage disaster. We cannot believe that we can only rely on the experiences of past disaster. We need in time to time, we need to completely change the educational system using the training and also our experience, but we need to educate. And one example, which is marginal to that, for instance, is the use of data and the security of personal data, which now should be taught even at the elementary school. And this is not the case. So I don't think that it is our duty, this cultural change. We can contribute, but we should not overestimate what we can effectively do.
Okay, thank you very much. So if you allow me, I will now move to our last speaker of the panel, Dr. Flavia Ricardo, and I welcome her once again. And let me introduce you, Dr. Flavia Ricardo. She comes from the Italian National Institute of Health in Rome, Italy. She's an experienced researcher in the infectious disease epidemiology unit with a demonstrated history of working in this field. She's skilled in epidemiology, lecturing, and prevention. She has a strong research professional she has a PhD focused on infectious diseases from the University of La Sapienza, Rome. Dr. Flavia Ricardo brings us the very up-to-date issue of the COVID-19 epidemic response. She's going to speak about from data to action, epidemiologists and decision makers in the management of the national COVID pandemic response in Italy. Welcome, Flavia.
Thank you very much for this lovely introduction. Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfectly.
So first of all, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to be with you today. And just building on prior presentation, I think it's really amazing how what was just explained by Professor Coco resonates with me, even though I come from a completely different background, because I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist. And so I completely relate to what was said in terms of the interactions of the different communities and the complexities, especially around uncertainties and around accountability and trust that were mentioned earlier. And I'm going to build on that to bring you just an example. And what I'm going to focus on is the link between the data and
Flavia, excuse me for interrupting. Can you please speak closer to the speaker, please, to micro?
Is that better?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm going to try to describe from the perspective of a scientist the link between data and outbreak management in Italy during COVID-19 pandemic response. And what I'm going to do is, did you see the change in the slide?
Yes, Flavia.
Oh, good, great. So just going to put this a little bit in context. So as you may know, Italy has been severely hit, like many other countries, by the COVID-19 pandemic. So as of yesterday, we counted over 4 million cases of laboratory confirmed infections. Of those, over 400,000 cases that have been hospitalized, with almost 14% of those in intensive care units. And we count, unfortunately, over 125,000 deaths related to the virus SARS-CoV-2. And in Italy, the outbreak started rather abruptly in the context of widespread local circulation. We were the first country detecting this local circulation in Europe. And what I will try to explain to you by telling you the story of this outbreak so far is that actions were actually largely driven by data, but this data was sometimes incomplete or uncertain or limited because this was a new infection caused by a new virus. And one difficult thing I learned also personally is explaining uncertainty and explaining what you don't know to a decision maker, because it's the hardest thing to do, or even a risk communicator when they're trying to develop messages for the population. So I'm going to split this talk in 3 moments. So we had a first acute epidemic phase in Italy starting from the end of February until the beginning of May 2020. Then we had a transition phase. That means that the cases went down. We didn't have an emergency anymore. We had the national health system that was dealing with the cases without being overwhelmed. And this went from June to September last year. And then we had another increase in cases like the rest of Europe from October until May. And now again, we've entered another transition phase in the epidemic. So I'm going to split this up in these 3 big moments to see how data grew, how the decisions were made, and what kind of instruments we tried to develop to translate data and the complexity of data. And I think Professor Cocchi explained that, do I really have to explain the model I'm using to calculate my RT, for example, into information, and that information that can be used to make decisions. So this is our very first phase of the epidemic curve. So this is data as of May last year. Just to point to your attention, when you see these curves, you will see some gray bars and some darker gray bars. And the lighter ones are the cases by the date of symptom onset. And the darker ones are the same cases, but they're reported by date of diagnosis. So we will have some cases that were diagnosed at a certain point, but their symptoms actually had developed much earlier. Okay, so that's why you see the lighter gray bars going further back in time compared with the darker gray bars. This said, so we had a moment in Italy where we didn't know that COVID-19 or better SARS-CoV-2 virus was circulating. Then we had a moment in which it was circulating, but we didn't know, which is where all the lighter gray bars are. So the patients that were later found reported that they had symptoms at that time, but we didn't know. And then we had a moment where it was detected and it was quite clear that the virus was now circulating rather broadly in the country. So there was a surveillance set up for severe cases of COVID-19, so severe pneumonia. At the beginning, this was what was believed, that this was causing a severe disease. That was set up on the 22nd of January, and the laboratory network capacity was stepped up because, again, a new virus means you have no tests. And we had to develop methods to try to confirm in a laboratory whether this was this infection or not. And then from after the 20th of February, when the first locally acquired case was found, there was a shift in the surveillance. So it became a surveillance of all laboratory confirmed cases, regardless of whether they had pneumonia or not. And so the story starts on the 22nd of January. So at the same time when the first system for surveillance was set up, Italy nominated a national task force under the coordination of the Ministry of Health to deal with SARS-CoV-2. At the time, it was called differently, but we'll use this the same name throughout the presentation. And there were some measures at the end of January regarding flights, direct flights from China. On the 31st of January, Italy declared a national health emergency because of this virus. And about a month later, on the 20th of February, we had our first locally acquired case in a city called Codogno in Lombardy. Following that, there were a number of progressively strict restriction measures, first around the Lodi province area where the case was found, then with red zones being extended to Lombardy and to the Veneto region, until on the 4th of March, we had our first national level physical distancing measures with the closure of the schools, which then led to the national lockdown on the 11th of March, that then was protracted and made more stringent in the following day. So as you can see, it was relatively fast for something which had never been done before. So restriction of movement and of liberties of people to this extent is unprecedented in Italy. And it was, I think, when you look at it that way, it looks like it was happening very fast. So let's have a look what the evidence was at that time that was supporting those actions. So the first thing I should say that when we look at back in January, the first mission of WHO, after which human-to-human transmission was confirmed, although the extent of it wasn't certain at the time, actually dates to the 21st of January. So before that time, it was uncertain whether this virus could actually be transmitted between humans. So it could have been something like the ordinary avian influenza cases we find, which are sporadic. We find them occasionally, but they're not well transmitted in human people, and therefore they don't have a potential to spread that well. And at the same time, ECDC was assessing that transmission between the European Union had a very low risk. So at the time when they nominated the task force, there really wasn't much evidence in terms of what was going to come later on. The first meeting of the Emergency Committee for the International Health Regulations on the 23rd of January did not declare a public health emergency of international concern because there was not enough data. And it was only on the 30th of January that this would be declared, which is the day before Italy declared its national emergency. So I think one thing I'd like to show is that there seems to be quite a nice correlation between the data that was being developed over time and the decisions that were made. One question is whether, we found, and then this was the main issue with us, we found this virus circulating widely when we found our first locally acquired case. So we had two imported cases in Rome at the end of January in people coming from China. And then we found some cases in Italians returning to Italy. But in Italy at that time, we had the national surveillance activities going on. And this surveillance activity looks at syndromes, influenza-like syndromes. So we're not looking for influenza virus, we're looking for flu symptoms. And at that, the 2019-2020 season is the red curve you see here, while the dark blue is 2018-2019, and the green curve is 2017-2018. So there was nothing happening in terms of flu-like illnesses that was different in 2019 or the beginning of 2020 compared with previous years. Actually, we had a low season compared with previous years. So we didn't really have much in terms of evidence that this was circulating. And this was also why it was such a big surprise when the first locally acquired case was actually linked, as you know, as things evolved and as we learned more, to a widespread circulation. We thought at the beginning we would be able to contain it. So there were some aspects that we have to think about, because some of these stories, when you look at it on hindsight, it gives a bit of a perspective which is a bit different to what you had at the time when you were making those decisions. And I think there's a nice paper from the Harvard Business Review that talks about cognitive biases. And it says something which I relate to in terms of my memories of that time. So in the early stages, the COVID-19 crisis in Italy did not look like a crisis. So we didn't really have that many elements of alarm before the first locally acquired case. And a lot of the decisions made, including the state of emergency, were met with skepticism, both by the public and by some of the policymakers. So, and this also is true. So if we look at the newspaper articles of that time, you will find that also the scientific community was largely divided on what the impact of this virus would be. There were some people saying that it was going to be the pandemic of the century, and some people saying this was nothing more than another kind of flu. So I think this is something we have to think about when, we look back and we say, yeah, on hindsight, probably it was good that the emergency was declared, but at the time there was discussion on whether this was the case. Well, definitely when it hit really hard. The areas that were hit by the disease were, their hospital services were overwhelmed very rapidly. And one thing that I think should be also mentioned is that population resilience was also exceptional during this first response phase, which again is something we didn't know to expect. We had to make exceptional decisions, take exceptional measures as a country and it was quite surprising to see the level of commitment and endorsements of the population. Also because the disease did not hit the country in the same way at the beginning. So the northern regions were much more involved and had a lot more transmission compared with the southern regions. And if we look at these two maps, you can see in pink, the age-adjusted attack rates per 100,000, and on the right, the simple number of cases in the first period. So starting from the 28th of January with the first imported cases, and then from the 20th of February, 31st of March, this is where the local transmission was really happening. And as you can see, there were a lot of regions that were affected, but mainly Lombardy. We're talking Emilia-Romagna, which is so if you can see my cursor, this is Lombardy, this is Emilia-Romagna, and this is Veneto, so these were and Piedmont. So these were the mainly affected areas in the very first part of the epidemic. And as some researchers mentioned on a paper in Frontiers, it was an immense challenge. Just to give an example, Lombardy, in 18 days, they saturated over 60% of their intensive care unit beds only for COVID-19. This is something that never happens, only for one disease. It was something unseen before. And another thing about context that I think it's important to mention about Italy is that we are a decentralized country when it comes to health, which means that there is a certain independence in terms of the management of the healthcare system in Italian regions. We have 21 Italian regions and autonomous provinces, and they adopt different models. So for example, in this paper, there was a discussion about the fact that in Lombardy, there was a hospital-based model. In Veneto, there's more a territorial-based model. In Emilia-Romagna, is a combination, also in Piedmont. So you will see different impacts in different...
Flavia, sorry, can you say more close to the microphone, because we are, yeah, okay. It's, okay, thank you.
Is that better?
Yes, yes.
So in terms of effectiveness, so what we're looking at here is the reproduction number. So when we look at an infectious disease, basically, we use mathematical modeling to look at whether it's being transmitted. So how many cases are being generated from an index case. So basically, just to make this, to simplify things, when your R is above 1, it means that each case is generating more cases, and your epidemic is in number of cases is increasing, your epidemic is expanding. If it's below 1, the number of cases decrease and your epidemic is receding. If it's equal to 1, it's stable. So at the beginning of an outbreak, when there are no measures in place, we talk about R0, which is the natural capacity of a pathogen to be transmitted. When we start putting measures in place, of course, this is going to decrease, and we're going to talk about RT. So the ability of the transmission of the pathogen with the mitigation measures in place. So we can see that, the natural transmission in Italy at the beginning was around 3. So 1 case on average generating 3 cases, which is quite a lot for an infectious disease. Then we had initial measures, if you remember, that were local. This brought down this transmission early on, and then the lockdown came. And so in basically the violet red are RTs are calculated on symptoms, so basically symptomatic cases. The blue is on hospitalized cases. We can see they both go down, and they go below 1. Whoops. They go below 1 around the end of March. So 1 month later, we already were in a situation in which the epidemic was decreasing. However, the number of cases was really very high. So before you see a very low number of cases, it takes time. It's not something that happens immediately. And then we had our transition phase, which we started to reopen things. And then you can see, the transmission started progressively to increase until the end of the summer. So what did we learn? So the first thing that science told us about this disease is that we had a problem in healthcare settings. We had a huge impact on healthcare workers. There were really high case fatality rates in long-term care facilities among the elderly. Older people, people with existing comorbidities were those at higher risk of dying for this disease. Transmission in households was a major amplifier. And then we later learned that this transmission was actually happening through super spreading events mainly, which is very different to flu from a technical standpoint. So it was behaving differently. So as a policy input, also for internationally, there was a lot of attention to contact tracing, which wasn't easy, especially considering the rapidity of the spread at the beginning. But also we learned also from the curve I just showed you how rapidly physical distancing, so keeping people separate, was actually impacting on transmission. So it was working. We knew we needed to prioritize fragile settings. We needed to optimize the logistics and the availability of personal protective equipment, of respirators, of other materials to cater for the emergency. But we also needed to protect our healthcare and social workers. This led to a remodeling of the healthcare system. As was mentioned before, we need to identify legal mechanisms to do this kind of work. And also, I think very early on, we found that lockdown was not sustainable. And this didn't come from health data. This came from economic and social data. So we knew that, okay, we could have done the first lockdown, but whatever was going to happen later on, we were not going to be able to redo the lockdown in the same way. So part of the expansion had to do with the funding and reorganization of the healthcare system. Also expansion of hospital bed capacity, expansion of human resources dedicated to contact tracing, to testing, and so forth. And this is just to give you an example of this. So these are the ICU beds. And in yellow, you see the beds that were available or were available before the emergency. And in blue, you can see the flexible increase during emergency of hospital bed availability over time. And you can see how they increase typically during the first wave, and then they go down during the transition period and start again during the fall of last year. So there's a flexibility in catering for the increased needs, which was set up to face this emergency. So that's what I talk about when you say remodeling your system. So it's a way of making it resilient to what is happening. Another thing, of course, was infection prevention and control. So how to avoid the infection being transmitted in hospitals, in long-term facilities, in elderly homes, in other contexts, or in the family. But also other activities like how am I going to test? How am I going to tell people what kind of methods we should be using? How should I treat my patients? What should I tell the people? So there was a lot of work being done on guidance and training. And Italy adopted a strategy that has stayed the same from the beginning. And I like the way it was described by this journalist, Coelho. He talked about the hammer and the dance, which I think is a very effective way of telling the story. So the hammer is the lockdown. So they started with very severe measures to bring down the curve. And then the dance is what we did from then on. So when we started reopening, we've started shifting until vaccination arrived, and we're looking towards a different perspective to controlling the outbreak, which is not only the distancing part. So this is what happened afterwards. So we talk about May. So we had a transition phase. As I said, cases started going down with the lockdown, and we started reopening progressively. So this was a 3-step approach every 2 weeks, which is not by chance. The incubation period of this virus is 2 weeks maximum. So the reopenings were based on the incubation period, and we were looking at how things were going. It was difficult to plan. We didn't know. So we checked it. So we went monitoring, and we opened progressively. And we also started a monitoring system conducting weekly risk assessments. And I'm going to go into that a little bit because that's an example of translating complex data into information. So during the transition phase, there was a gradual reopening, but those were strongly defined by guidance. There was stringent distancing. A lot of investments was made by private entrepreneurs to ensure that they could reopen restaurants, facilities in a certain way. There was a lot of investment on the resilience, as I said, of the healthcare system, enhancing the monitoring capacity, and a lot of training guidance in a context in which transmission decreased. We didn't have the emergency situation in the hospital services anymore. But what we had at the same time, we needed to, in a context in which there was an improved data completeness, because of course, when you have a big emergency, the problem is also the data is not brilliant, right? So the moment that things get better, also your data gets better, more timely, more complete. The testing capacity increased. So suddenly we were not seeing the tip of the iceberg anymore. We're starting to look at something a bit more consistent on the number of new cases that were being detected. We didn't have evidence of uncontrolled transmission. We didn't have an overburdening of the hospital services. We had an increased resilience. As I said, there were a number of factors set up to increase the strength of the healthcare system as a whole. And it was a time to invest in preparedness, which is what, again, was mentioned in the previous talk. So we invested on how are we going to prepare for the next wave? And again, if some of you have seen the debate during the last summer, again, also the scientific and political communities, they were strongly divided on whether there's going to be a second wave in the first place. And it was also a time to systematically translate data into action. And this is an example of this. So we developed a mixed method assessment, so mainly quantitative with a few qualitative indicators that provided a categorization of risk for each region, each week, of having an uncontrolled and unsustainable epidemic. And this was regulated through a law, a decree of the Minister of Health with all these indicators defined. They have two algorithms for decision, one looking at probability. So they're all indicators that revolve around transmission. So increased cases, increased RT, and so forth. And the other one is on impact, which mainly looks at hospital services overwhelming, both general and ICU services. And for each week, each region has a categorization for each of those algorithms that then comes together in a matrix that puts together impact and probability. So at the end of the day, every week for every region, we have a risk. Is it low? Is it moderate? Is it high? And this is something which synthesizes in a single word a complex number of data elements. Another thing we did was we looked at scenarios. We used modeling to look at, what's going to happen in the autumn. And based on that, we had preparedness activities, checklists, lessons learned from the first phase, and then the readiness. So what comes just before. So a strategic plan, so how we were going to face the autumn wave, looking at scenarios, looking at the risk levels, what kind of actions. And this is what it came up to. So we have started having this monitoring by week from the beginning of May. So every line in this colored section represents a region, and the green is low risk, the yellow is moderate risk. And then you have the moderate risk with a high probability of moving to high risk, and situations in which the risk was not assessed because of data quality. And what we can see overall is that progressively, following the end of July, more or less, the situation was changing in Italy. We were able to track that. Cases were increasing. And then we were able to map when the acute phase started rather precisely. And then it continued to monitor the outbreak. So if we look at this is the risk level as of March, and you can see how it follows quite nicely the peaks of the outbreak. And you could have that with a relay of 1 week in the data. So the data was consolidated the week before and provided, and it's publicly available. So based on that, from November, beginning of November, as cases escalated, as you can see, rather steeply, decision-making took an automatic decision approach that was data-based. So they looked at risk assessment, they looked at the RT, they looked since January at the 7-day incidence. You'll see in January, we had a problem with the variant Alpha emerging with a higher transmission. So there was a modulation of the decision-making process to account for the changing virus. And we looked at the effectiveness of that, and we were able to quantify the reduction in RT in the different color zones. So we found that, if you were in a yellow zone, you had a certain reduction. If you were in an orange zone, you had another reduction, red zone, a higher reduction, and that all of them pretty much, at least in the fall of 2020, brought our RT below that one. That means below the epidemic threshold. So we were able to document also the impact of the measures. And this is what it looks like, again, if we look at the red line, which is transmission by symptoms, the blue line, transmission according to hospitalization. We can see that, we had a number of entry position and screening provisions in the summer that around the end of the second half of August, we had a number of cases increasing because people were returning from holidays, We had a number of clusters related to nightclubs, for example, but we managed to keep it down in a moment where Europe was pretty much increasing everywhere. And then finally, we had our first epidemic alert at the end of September, and then the epidemic was announced officially at the beginning of October. They had additional mitigation measures, the first national level measures, as I said, with all the color zones, and the 3rd of November, and then the RT going down again below threshold, so that most Italian regions actually de-escalated to the yellow area at the beginning of December. Vaccination happened then, and that was a huge aspect. From the 27th of December, the whole of Europe started their vaccination campaign. And just to show you, on the left, you have vaccination coverage by age group, in which you can see in orange the proportion of cases that are pending second dose, and in green, those that have completed their vaccination cycle. As other countries, we prioritize the higher age groups because they're more fragile and prone to severe illness. So you can see that the vaccination is relatively satisfactory in terms of coverage for the older age groups, and now we're moving to try to increase coverage in the younger age groups. And then on the right, you can see just an example of some of the reports we publish on impact. So we look at comparing the ratio of incidence, so the number of new cases in the population, between vaccinated people in the first 14 days. So we know that to not have an effect, vaccination needs a time frame. So this time frame is around 14 days to have the immune response. So we compare these same vaccinated people in the window in which they still have to mount their response, and afterwards in time. And you can see that the ratio of the new cases per 100,000 decreases. And this is a proxy of the impact of the vaccination, which changes your likelihood of getting an infection. So your population is changing. At the same time, though, the virus started to change. We started to get these variants. So there was a lot of work being done to try to increase the capacity to genotype and to sequence viruses, which is a very complex and costly activity. So from February, we documented that the so-called UK variant, the Alpha variant, was prevalent. And then there was a gradual emergence of other variants. And we found that this Alpha variant was much more transmissible. So it was more likely, it had a higher transmissibility, which means that if the original one was 3, this was 50% higher. And then, the decision-making process shifted in May, very recently. As you can see, the criteria has changed, but it's still data-based. So here now we're looking at incidence and occupancy rate. So the point is, decision-making may modulate the kind of data it decides to use, but it was still pretty much data-driven. And this is my last Epidemic Curve showing the situation as of yesterday. So as we said, there was an acute phase, there was a transition phase, but then we had a second acute phase. And as you can see, the number of cases is much higher, also because our testing capacity was much higher. And we look at the color zones being introduced. This is early November, and then additional measures being stepped up in Christmas. You can see there's a peak there. And then the change in the definition of the mitigation measures in May. Here we have our vaccination campaign starting, and here we have our prevalence of Alpha variant being detected in Italy. And locally acquired Delta variants, for example, were then detected as well, Delta Kappa. So in conclusion, I hope I showed you a little bit of the context in which the SARS-CoV-2 epidemic developed in Italy. Being the first country meant that a lot of the decisions were ice-breaking decisions. We really didn't have much to look at in Europe in terms of inspiration. The only country that had an experience at that time was China, and it was very different. Or places like, for example, South Korea, but they have a very different healthcare system, very different organization compared with the situation in Italy. The response approach was the hammer and the dance. And I hope I showed you a little bit how the data supported that strategy. in an evolving situation. But the drawback is because it was new, because we didn't know many things, it was very difficult to plan a long time ahead. And we've seen that, even in countries that have tried to plan ahead, this has sometimes changed, like in the UK recently. And then just to show you the kind of tools that were developed that was trying to help transform data into information. So I hope that was interesting, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Flavia. This was a very timely presentation in the conference. And this is one that certainly brought to the general public the importance of having science and decision makers working together to deal with this such a complex problem on which many things were unknown. Of course, there will be many questions, I'm sure, but I'll just invite you to take one from Elder Lima. If you can please read the question because it's a bit long and try to summarize it before you answer it, please. In the question, can you see it? He's asking, how do you see
the integration of data and information and off-the-shelf software solutions from private sector sources into disaster risk management, such as Blue Dot Company, which algorithms scours news reports and airline ticketing data predicting the spread of disease that goes linked to the flu outbreak in China. The company was able to send out word of the outbreak to its customers. Yes, this is a great point. I think in terms of the use of this type of information, it's not only in the private sector, also in the public sector. There is something we call epidemic intelligence. And part of that is called event-based surveillance, which means that we look at exactly this, non-conventional sources of information for the health sector. So yes, on the 31st of December was also when we received the alert, for example, from ECDC, from the European Center for Disease Control, and there were initial reports. So absolutely, I'm a big fan of epidemic intelligence. So I'm also because I'm part of the Italian network for epidemic intelligence. So absolutely, it's a great point. And one way we try to integrate this, for example, is also in the monitoring. We're looking actively at media, blogs, and Twitter and other sources of information to monitor the types of spread. So at the beginning, it was a lot about, where were the clusters? At the beginning, we didn't know much about this virus. So we were looking at how it was transmitted, which were the main areas. And now the focus is very much on the variants. So we're using this type of approach to support the traditional surveillance and data detection activities. And I think it's a great point. And I really hope that we will continue integrating these several sources of information to allow us to have the best picture in the earliest time.
Thank you very much, Flavia. I'd like to ask if anyone of our panelists want to add some
I have a question.
Final comment. Please, Daniela, go ahead.
Thank you. Flavia, at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about the initial skepticism of the decision makers with respect to the first scientific evidence and the first scientific opinion about the emerging epidemic and then pandemic. Do you think that this depends on the kind of the relationship that there is between scientists and decision maker in the health field, or why? Because we know this, we have this kind of experience in other risks, but for as far as it concerns the civil protection, our daily relationship with our research institutes and competence centers makes us put us in the position to be ready. If our scientific institutes tell us that there is a problem, we operate immediately because we know that they are reliable. So which was the problem in that moment?
I think the main issue was that this was new. And even the scientific community was very divided on whether this was going to be a problem or not. to be frank, I mean, until the end of January, there was, I mean, still no evidence. And even WHO on the 14th of January said there's no evidence of human-to-human transmission. Now, for a person like me, if there is no human-to-human transmission, the pandemic potential basically is not there. The other aspect is severity of disease. So at the beginning, the data that was available was for probably a very selected number of cases among the most severe, because that's what happens. You know, usually you see the most critical patients first, because they're the ones that end up in ICU, they're the ones that die, you know, so they're more visible. What we later learned that there is the majority of cases that got this infection are people that either have no symptoms at all or have very mild symptoms. And those were completely not identified at the beginning. There was a huge debate on whether there were asymptomatic cases and whether these cases could transmit. So I think the main issue is, I think what Professor Cocco said before, I mean, it's uncertainty. And it's really hard to veiculate and decide when you have scientists on the other side that basically tell you, I'm sorry, I don't know. And I think this was the thing that made that decision-making, I think, sometimes discussed, because some people would say, you know, it's better to be safe than sorry. And then there's other people saying, but look, you know, other countries are denying this is going to be an outbreak. So why are we declaring an emergency? And of course, and they're all valid points. So I wouldn't say it's about trust. It's about the fact that this was a new virus. And sometimes I think at the beginning, when we also spoke to the media to say, you know, this is a new virus, this didn't really come home as the seriousness that it was. It's new. We don't know it. We have to learn about it. And as we learn, we will let you know how it goes. So that's why it was, I think, at the beginning, difficult to make decisions, because really there wasn't much data, and you could interpret that data in different ways, and you would be right with the data you had at the time. If we look back now, of course, our vision is completely different.
Flavia, this is related to the previous question of Daniela. We saw throughout the world many different reactions from different countries that took different ways. Was this due to differences in scientific counseling or on the perception of the decision makers and politicians? What's your opinion?
Well, I mean, as I said before, scientific evidence was limited. So you had to make decision on with a lot of uncertainty. And of course, it would depend on a number of elements. I think also of the population involved. You know, the sensitivity of the population, the sensitivity of the ruling part of that population. But I still think that, you know, there was a lot of scientific debate, and a lot of that debate was on TV. Which brings back to what was talked about before. You know, I think this in a way was good. It was super transparent what was being discussed. I think it also generated a lot of confusion. It wasn't maybe the easiest way to gain trust on what you were discussing. And so I was very surprised. I mean, opening the TV in January, February 2020, I felt like I was in a scientific conference, but it was actually a talk show. And that's the type of thing. So I think it was about context, it's about situations, and it's about risk perception. I think there was different risk perceptions in different countries. A bit of it has to do on your, on your knowledge of the strength and the weaknesses of your healthcare system. I believe that, some colleagues, I was very surprised at the beginning of the outbreak. There were some colleagues from other countries that had interactions within Europe. They were telling me, we don't have ICU, element capacity to withstand this. We have to lock down. It's about knowledges of your strength, of your weaknesses, perception of risk, and all these things come together. And it doesn't always mean that you come to the same conclusions.
Okay, thank you, Flavia. I don't know, Massimo, if you want to say something.
Yes, Domingos, thank Andrea, do you want to go?
No, please, Massimo, go ahead.
No, I think that, what Flavia just presented is very, to me, very illustrative of an issue. First, the role of the media, because it is clear that we are dealing with the communication. So communication is present at different level with different structure in all the three interface between science and society, science and decision maker and society. However, the way in which this communication is modulated is mediated by the media. And here the issue is also, if we discuss about a cultural change, we need to make clear that the media, they have a role, they are the mediators, they are not out of the game, they are not independent, because they are part of also of the cultural change that we were discussing before. The other example that I would like to mention is that risk perception, of course, it is difficult to be measured and assessed. The civil protection in Italy tried many times. I know those attempts for the seismic and volcanic crisis, but they are. And again, risk perception can be modulated, and therefore there is a time dependence of risk perception. And sometimes when you have the emergency, the short-term perception overcome on the long term. This is again a way in which the highest is the preparedness, so therefore the resilience of the society before the emergencies occur, even if in the case of the pandemic, as Flavia Ricardo shown, was unprecedented, because what they did was decisions on some things that never happened before. But of course, I would like to raise these two points. First, that the role of the media should be taken into account, because they are the acceptance level of the risk about the society is modulated by the media. And the second one, that the difficulties of communicating the uncertainties is not only technical, but because again, it is the literacy of the society to make clear how to manage the uncertainties. So if during an earthquake in Italy, we still have newspaper articles discussing about two magnitude differences of 0.2 between two research organizations, means that the awareness level and the preparedness is low. So this is a KPI that we don't have much. So if the discussion is discussing about the tiny difference in a magnitude estimates and not on the real application of the actions to mitigate the risk, this means that we are still far away. So disseminating and explaining the uncertainties, it is difficult because it's not a two-way dialogue. And as soon as you take decisions, as we have seen for the COVID, and these decisions are somehow explained to society by somebody else, which is a journalist, I think that we are a communication channel which is not completely under control, and this is the real difficulty. I am nothing against the media. I am in favor of communication and transparency, but I think that the media itself should be aware that they have a role, and they are not the minor actors for risk perceptions. And this entered also in legal prosecution and trial. We already experienced this. So this is not a secondary issue.
Thank you very much, Massimo. And we are now coming to the end of our webinar. From my part, I would like to thank once again to all of you that attended and participated in this webinar, and to the speakers in particular. If you allow me, I'd like to give a special thanks to the members of my team, ADAI, who supported in the preparation and the development of this webinar. A word of thanks to them. And now to close the webinar and to say some final words, I leave the floor to Andrea Prote, the coordinator of our roadmap project. Please, Andrea.
Domingos, thanks. I'm very happy about this webinar, because when we planned it, we had an idea, but I think what came out, at least for me, was really amazing. Very interesting presentation. Also, I noticed the participation of people through the messages. We hope that maybe some future comments will come to us. Maybe you think about the presentations. You can watch again this webinar. I remind all participants that Luis Ribeiro sent a message, so you have a link of YouTube. You will find it also on the roadmap website. So please, if you missed something or you want to view it again, you can do that, or you can spread the news among interested colleagues. I would like to thank all speakers, all participants, and please let me express my special thanks to Professor Viegas and to the group of ADAI, because I think the organization of this online webinar, I should say, it was perfect, and this is very good. So we are a little bit out of time, but it was a very fruitful meeting. So have a nice day and a nice weekend, and we will see in the next meetings and opportunities. Thank you.